Life Unrehearsed on CJAD 800. Brought to you by Marco Vendramini of IG Private Wealth Management. MarcoVendramini.com.
There will be an answer. Let it be. Or let it be.
And welcome back to Life Unrehearsed. I'm Matt Del Vecchio, specializing in free retirement, home search, and senior transition support. In studio here with Corey Sirota, clinical social worker and psychotherapist specializing in grief and loss. You familiar with that song, Let It Be, Corey? I heard you saw Paul McCartney Thursday night. How was it?
I'm surprised you didn't hear me singing from the concert. Oh, my gosh. It was, the truth is, it's my daughter who's a huge Beatle fan. Of course, my husband and I are Beatle fans, but my daughter is. And so when he was coming in, she said, I have to go. And she wasn't sure who. I said, I will go with you. And then it turned out that Andy said, I will go with you. So we went. Now, we were sitting, okay, you know what the term the gods are? I could have high-fived God from where I was sitting, but it was well worth it. I don't know if I enjoyed seeing him or watching my daughter watch the show more.
That's so
That's
good.
a toss-up.
This was a
really.
Bucket list for her. I heard 2 hours, 45 minutes without a break.
Yeah.
Well, good for him. Good for him. Corey, we've got a great guest coming up.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of Let It Be, nobody more than Paula Toledo had to learn how to let things be, given her background and her story. We are very grateful to have Paula Toledo here with us in studio. She had a devastating experience with her husband who died by suicide, which led her to have to turn her life, as you can imagine, completely around. And what she's done based on her experiences, she has now become a professional speaker. She continues to inspire tons of people who are experiencing grief and loss. So welcome to the show, Paula.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome, Paula. Thanks for being with us.
I was very a little bit suspect when I was giving the introduction because I wanted to let you tell the story. And so would you mind starting by telling the story and your subsequent journey?
For sure. Well, I grew up in Montreal, but I moved to Vancouver in '93 with the love of my life, who was my college sweetheart. And we lived together for many, many, many years. And he lived with anxiety, but was very high functioning. And he was very successful. We had a great community around us. He was very in tune with his health and his well-being. And about a couple of months before my second son was born, he fell very ill. His anxiety escalated, and he fell into a major depressive episode. And he was hospitalized and on medications. And I accompanied him during his journey. And unfortunately, 2 weeks after my youngest son was born, he died by way of suicide. So it was life completely unrehearsed, but life rehearsed in a way, because everything that I'd experienced in my life, to growing up with the parents that I grew up with who were so focused on mind, body, and spirit, to meeting my late husband, Pierre, who taught me about wonder and curiosity and adventure and compassion, to working as a brand marketer and to becoming a singer-songwriter and a storyteller. And now I do content for compassion. So that was how I ended up doing the TedX talk and hoping to inspire other people that are working through adversity, because I think, there's death, but there's loss in so many facets of life.
For sure.
So that's my story. And
incredible story. It's we're talking about overcoming grief and loss with mental health advocate and motivational speaker Paula Toledo. Can't possibly imagine losing a spouse, children 2 weeks old and 2 years old. But this has brought you through. That was 8 years ago?
That was almost 9 years ago.
9 years ago.
9 years ago in October.
You've been on a 9-year journey here, and I'm sure you've had your ups and downs, especially towards the beginning. Tell us a little bit of how you've been able to cope with it. And I'd like specifically for you to mention your Ode to Wonder, which I find fascinating.
Right. So when my late husband, when he died by suicide, my mom at the same time was tragically fighting her last days of cancer. So I moved back home to Montreal to introduce my youngest son to her. She was waiting for his birth. And a couple of months later, she died. So I was dealing with the death of my husband, of my mother, my my father had passed on 2 years prior, and I was nursing a newborn. I was completely sleep deprived, and every waking hour I was in the hospital trying to visit my mom.
Right.
So it was, and I should back up also 2 weeks after, well, about a week after I gave birth to my youngest son, I almost died as well. There was placenta left in me, and I had tremendous blood loss. I ended up back in the hospital overnight with blood transfusions. So it was a very very difficult time for me. Yes. And I remember thinking, how am I going to get through this? Like, how does one get through this? And when I was strong enough, I went to see this therapist, and he just gave me one piece of advice. He said, well, what has helped you through difficult times in the past? Right. And I said, well, I used to meditate, but now I don't have time to meditate. I don't have time for anything other than sleeping and eating and nursing my newborn. And he said, well, what anything? And I said, I guess I could try to meditate. And he said, yeah, you can do mindfulness while you're nursing your son. So that helped me. And that started becoming a bit of a bridge to what I now have as 4 pillars in my life to help me stay well mentally. Because I do believe that we focus so much on our physical well-being, but we forget about our mental well-being. We forget that we should do it every day.
So can we elaborate on those 4 pillars? Because I know them, but I'd love for you to share them with everyone.
Well, at that time, I was very isolated. So I didn't have any friends in Montreal. My parents were gone. I did have my family who were taking good care of me, my brothers and sisters. But I didn't have the luxury to leave the house. So there were just 4 things that I could do within the realm of my 4 walls that I had control and power over. And that's the big thing when you're working through adversity, is to feel that you have control somehow of your life. And so those 4 pillars are humanity. So that's paying it forward or being a service for others. Arts and awareness. So that was my meditation and engaging in the arts because I'm an artist. Travel, which doesn't necessarily mean going away to Barcelona like I did this summer, but discovery. So discovering something new.
It could even be in your local neighborhood.
It could be on the internet, cafe. Something that actually charges you. And the last one is sports and nature. So to engaging in something that gets your blood pumping and being in nature.
And, those 4 pillars, you have an acronym for that? It's
HATS. It's
right?
HATS.
Humanity, arts and awareness, travel, and sports and
so
nature.
I call it my hats off mental wellness regime that I try to do one every day, or if not all, because it's a self-compassion regime of mental well-being. And hats off saying, it's job well done, because you're kind of patting yourself on the back.
As I don't think we do enough of.
Yes.
And also how you pointed out that you don't have to do all 4.
Exactly. You can do one. It could just be like an act of kindness. Whoops.
Yeah.
And, you talked about self-compassion. You've mentioned it a few times. We're going to head out to traffic soon, though, Paula. But you've described it as being one of the most important things you can do for your mental well-being, period. Just this self-compassion. So we want to hear a little bit more about that. But
Life Unrehearsed on CJAD 800. Brought to you by Marco Vendramini of IG Private Wealth Management. MarcoVendramini.com.
And yes, the show must go on. Welcome back to Life Unrehearsed. Matt Del Vecchio here with Corey Sirota, and we're talking to mental health advocate who had to deal with the suicide of her husband 8 years ago when her 2 children were just 2 years old and 2 weeks old. An amazing woman, Paula Toledo, telling us about how she's gone through this journey and is the inspiration to thousands of people. And Paula, thank you for being on the show again with us. Just before traffic, we talked about this term you use quite often called self-compassion. And you're even saying that this is probably one of the most significant things we can do for ourselves concerning mental well-being. So can you explain self-compassion?
Well, for me, self-compassion was really just taking the time to recognize that you're, working through something difficult, but not beating yourself up for what you're going through. And I think for a lot of survivors of people that have died by way of suicide, for a lot of caregivers, for anyone experiencing loss or adversity, we can often look at ourselves and go, well, that was my fault, or there was something that I did that caused that to happen. And self-compassion is just recognizing that this event happened, but you don't tear yourself apart over it. And I do believe that, you can't really have compassion for other people until you have compassion for yourself. So for me, it was really healing that. I spent a lot of time healing that. And, whenever you get that thought in your head that, oh, I should have done this, or it was my fault that the shoulds, it's like a radio station, I just switch it. Yeah. I turn it off.
Unless you're on CJAD.
Unless you're on CJAD.
Yeah. Well, I say you stop being should on.
Yeah.
But I want to actually expand. That's such an important point, but I want to expand as a grief counselor myself. I don't only see, this is your work that you're doing is much more than just I don't want to minimize it, but the fact that your husband died by suicide. You work with and recognize loss as much bigger, as do I. There's all kinds of loss that people experience, and the work you're doing really does speak to many in all different kinds of contexts. So also, would you then please elaborate on how you see or how you define loss?
Right, because,
Yes.
like you were saying before, it could be anxiety, stress, depression, grief.
Loss of direction, loss
Absolutely.
of relationship, moving, any unwelcome change, as I call it.
That's the one universal thing, is that we all experience loss. And so my older brother, lives with schizophrenia. He has a mental illness. And I lost my brother, the brother that I knew when I was in high school, and he was in his 20s. And so that was my first big loss, that the brother that I knew completely changed. And I had to face this new perspective of living with a brother that was different from how he was growing up with me. So there was the loss of that. There could be loss of, people often, when I speak about my children and talk about their loss, they say, well, how could they experience loss? They were 2 weeks old and 2 years old. And I said, well, they have a loss of a dream.
That's right.
They have a loss of a dream, of a future, of having a father in their life. And that's a massive loss. So yeah, they may not remember him, but that is a big loss. And if I, as a mother, weren't to recognize and acknowledge that would be such a big, big wound for them, a big, huge pain and suffering for them. So I think just the fact that I acknowledge that is, it helps them in their journey.
So important.
Absolutely.
You're listening to Paula Toledo here on Life Unrehearsed. She's a mental health advocate and motivational speaker. And just listening to you, I understand why you're a motivational speaker, Paula. And speaking of that, you are a TedX talk speaker. Tell us about one you just did not so long ago.
Right. That was in May of this year. And it was a big challenge because for obvious reasons, it was very emotional. But I really believed that wonder helped me heal. And it was also the bridge that crushes stigma. That was the title of the talk. Wonder is the bridge that crushes stigma. Because I think that if we can open our eyes to see that things could be different, that people could be different, that leads to compassion. And compassion in the end crushes stigma. You can't have stigma with compassion. So that was one aspect of wonder. And the second aspect of wonder was seeing mental illness through the eyes of my children, because I, when they were old enough, had to explain to them what happened to their father and that he had a mental illness. And so I had to explain things in age-appropriate ways. As they got older, I'd explain a little bit more and a little bit more until I could explain suicide to them. But it was really this process of me seeing things through childlike eyes, very innocently and matter-of-factly, and really distilling it down to the truths of the science and without the stigma. And that was so compelling for me, because I realized that if I can do this, if my children can learn about this through me and through wonder, and I can learn about it through wonder, then everybody can learn about it with that same lens and be able to really see that, there's no reason that this stigma should exist.
I couldn't agree with you more. We talk a lot about in the work I do with children about helping them, wondering with them. We talk about doing that with them. So can you speak a little bit? You have a Facebook page, a group called Ode to Wonder?
Ode to Wonder. I have a blog called Ode to Wonder. I have a podcast, and I feature people that have gone through adversity who are extremely resilient, because during my hard time when I was trying to find ways to make it through, I saw a lot of websites that were that took me to a darker place. I wanted to share hope. So this is a place where I share hope about positive mental well-being. I've got a Facebook page called Ode to Wonder that also has a group called Ode to Wonder Resiliency.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Paula, for everything that you
Thank you,
shared with
Paula.
us, for your courage to come on the show and to show people that even though life happens, there is hope. There's a light. How can people get a hold of you?
They can find me on Instagram, and my handle is Ode to Wonder. Facebook, my personal page is Paula M. Toledo. And they can go to my website, odetowonder.com.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Next week on Life Unrehearsed, please join us as we're going to be talking about something called Mind Strong and Youth Strong, two very important initiatives for adults and children for dealing with mental health. And we are also very pleased, Corey, we're excited to have our next guest next week, Dina Pastanji, an incredible woman who had a massive stroke at the young age of 29 years old. She's 35 now. You won't believe some of the things she's doing. You can catch that show next week and every Sunday on Life Unrehearsed on CJAD 800 at 4 p.m.